For this one, I have this tube out of, I believe it was aluminum foil. A paper towel tube is a little more collapsible, not as strong, but the tubes that you get out of, say, plastic wrap or aluminum foil, they're a lot thicker and sturdier. I cut them down to the same size. They're going to be the legs of our little scarecrow. And I have a roll of toilet paper. It is the very cheap toilet paper that you can get from Walmart for less than $1. And that's a good thing because I didn't need a whole lot of the toilet paper, so I removed a lot of it off of there. And I am just going to shape it a little bit to make his little shoulders. I did cut just like a 1/2 inch off the entire roll to shorten it a little bit because I'd already cut the legs, so I was trying to make the height of the torso and the legs, match up and look good. But it just depends on how tall you want your scarecrow to be. You could make him very tall with long legs and, use a taller, leave the toilet paper as tall as it came. I did, so that the toilet paper wouldn't be unraveling underneath his shirt, I did add some Mod Podge there just to the edges. I have one of these, I don't even know what they're called. They put packs of these balls out. Is it wiffle ball? Perhaps. If anybody knows, you can put it down in the comments. But they have a pack, I believe it comes in a pack of 6 for $1.25 or $1.50 now at my Dollar Tree. And I'm just going to cover it in 2 socks from the Dollar Tree. I got those socks and then I stained them with some tea for another project. I was making some snowmen, and so this is the same type of head that I used to make some snowmen last year. I had some ivory cotton fabric and I stained it using some coffee. I'm going to use that fabric for his pants and his the handkerchief to go around his neck. I guess if it's going around his neck, it would be called a neckerchief. I also have some of this fabric that I got this year at Dollar Tree. It's just some plaid fabric. And I'm going to use some watered down antique wax to darken it up. It was just a little too bright. I cut down the socks a little bit, and I'm not a sewer, I do not sew, but I can sew on a button onto a shirt, and so I thought I could do this, and it was very easy, so if I can do it, you can do it. But there are, you notice there were holes in those balls, and so I wanted to sink in his eyes just a little bit, so it looked more like a plush head instead of a hard ball, and so the eye wouldn't look like it was just going to fall off his face. And so I sent the needle through that hole in that ball and I pulled it tight, and then I glued it. I glued the the thread there, and so now his little eyeball is sort of sunk in his head just a little bit. I thought it gave it a little more of a natural look, like a plush head would if you were making a stuffed animal. And I kept thinking while I was making this, I kept thinking about those little characters on the Dark Crystal. I don't know if y'all remember those, but at this stage, my scarecrow was looking like those little creatures and not like a scarecrow, but it gets better. I tied the sock at the bottom with a rubber band, and then I put some hot glue in there so that it wouldn't come open. And then later on, I also tie some twine on there. So I'm, trying to make sure that his head isn't going to come unraveled. I'm going to use what's left of those socks and roll them up into 2. These are going to be his arms underneath, inside of his shirt sleeves. Now, all of these steps, if you do sew, obviously you could replace using hot glue with sewing. I took the toilet paper roll, and I don't think I covered this part. It kind of went by quickly. But inside of there, I did reinforce the inside of that toilet paper tube with some of those trimmings of that cardboard tube, just to make it so when you squeeze his body, it wasn't going to sort of collapse in on itself. I just rolled and glued everything. Again, if you can sew, you could do sewing for these steps instead, but I wanted to make this as no sew as possible for those of you that don't sew, like me. I rolled up his arms pretty tightly. I didn't want them to be too big around and bulky. And then I did tuck in the fabric on the top where his little neck's gonna be. And I cut the bottom of his shirt into triangles. I thought I liked that look. And then I just simply glued the tops of his arms into his head hole there on the top. I wanted to cover the bottom there underneath his shirt, so I took some thin cardboard and then glued that to the toilet paper roll, and then I also glued some fabric on top of that. So that's going to be sort of like, his pants, where the pant legs meet his bottom there. I took those cardboard tubes for his legs and I just loosely rolled some fabric. I wanted to make sure it wasn't tight on there. I didn't want his pants to look sort of like skinny jeans. I wanted them to be a little loose on his legs. I tucked in and glued that fabric at the top, and then at the bottom I did a sort of rough snipping. I wanted to leave some excess hanging over at the bottom because I'm not going to give him shoes. It's just going to be he's going to end at the bottoms of his pants. And so I just, wanted to rough up the fabric there. For his nose, at first I was going to make it very big, and later on I trimmed that up a little bit and make it a little bit smaller, but I used that same watered down antique wax to darken up his nose a little bit. I simply hot glued his legs on, leaving a little space in between. And for the bottoms of his legs there, I'm just going to cut out some more of that chipboard, some thin cardboard. And then I was going to originally give him a base, attach him to a base, like a wood plaque or something. But then I realized as I was working with him that he was actually standing up fairly well. He just needed to be weighted down. And so I took some little rocks and I filled his legs about halfway up with those rocks. And then I capped it off with that thin cardboard. And I made the thin cardboard just a little bit bigger. You can see there. And it's just a little bit bigger than the cardboard tube itself. So it gave it a even wider base. And he is very sturdy. He stands up very nicely on his own. I trimmed his nose down, and then I did want to give him a sewn look. I did glue his nose on to his face. And then I took a needle and thread. And I'm just going to, I don't even know what this stitch is called. I should have looked that up before I started my voiceover. But I'm just going to go back. Is it called a back stitch? I don't know what it's called. I dabbled in embroidery, but I didn't go far with it. So I don't know what the stitches are called. But I'm just going to go back to where the stitch came out, and then I'm going to loop around to make a solid line of the thread instead of there being spaces in between like a running stitch. I want it to be a solid line of thread, but it's very basic. I mean, you can see here how easy it is, and whenever I would need to jump to another part of his face, I would just go underneath that sock there and run that needle up underneath his underneath the sock there, and then to go from his mouth to his nose. And then whenever I would end what I was working on, I would just bring it out down low on his neck, and that way I wasn't sort of tying off and leaving knots on his face. And you can see there that I went down really close to his neck because that's going to be covered up by his neckerchief later. And then I just tied that off and then hot glued it. Now, if you wanted a sewn look but did not want to mess with the needle and thread, you actually could just glue little clippings of thread or embroidery floss onto, or twine, thin twine, onto his face. I've done that before. Just use some like Aleene's tacky glue or something like that, and just glue those little pieces of thread, and that would give the look without you having to actually sew. I liked how that coffee darkened up his pants, but I wanted his neckerchief to be a little darker. So I took that watered down antique wax and went over that, and that turned out nicely. I'm glad there was like some contrast. I didn't want him to be too awful matchy-matchy. I have this canvas bag that I bought a while back at the Dollar Tree, and I wanted to use it for his hat because it was a pretty stiff material. I just cut out a donut shape. I ended up not using this particular donut shape because of the design on the other side. I was worried it would show through, and it probably would have, but I did use this donut shape that I cut out here as sort of a template for 2 more of them that I glued together, and this is going to be the brim of his hat. I'm not using any sort of pattern or anything. I'm just eyeballing this. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's a scarecrow. And whenever someone makes a scarecrow, they're not worried about, him looking perfect. It's just supposed to resemble a human. So if, your scarecrow just remotely looks like a scarecrow, you did it. I glued a cone of this fabric. I just sort of made a triangle and then wrapped it around and glued it to itself to make a cone. And that's going to be the top of his hat. I could have made this better, and honestly, after I made this cone here, I thought I should probably redo that, but I didn't. I love making projects like this. That's why I also love making Halloween projects, because it doesn't have to be as perfect as your sort of everyday decor that you keep in your home. You know, if you're going to put something on your wall or have something out year round, you want it to be pretty perfect. But something like this sort of rustic fall decor, and then also, of course, Halloween decor, it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be rustic. It can be a little messy looking. It's just supposed to be fun, as long as you make it, look fun. That's really the point of it. I slipped the brim down over the cone, and then I just glued that, and then I'll be cutting away the excess underneath there. I wanted his hat to have some folds in it for those bends and folds to stay. And so I just put on some finger protectors and then stuck my hand inside his hat, and then sandwiched some hot glue to sort of pinch the fabric and hot glued that so that it would have a permanent bend in the hat. For his hair, I'm just hot gluing some of this straw-like raffia. I wasn't sure which one I was going to use. I have the Dollar Tree raffia there and some Spanish moss, but ended up just using the straw-like raffia. That neckerchief, I just tied it on there, but I did secure it with a little bit of hot glue, and I don't even know if I described that part, but I just cut a triangle of fabric, and that was it. The edges are fraying, and that's perfect. It looks good for a scarecrow. I did make a couple of patches, put one on his knee and one on his hat. I originally was going to make him much more rustic, but honestly, he almost looks like he's ready to go to church. He's a little dapper, but that's okay. Not all scarecrows have to be dirty and creepy. Maybe I'll make another, scarecrow that's a little more rustic later on in the year. And he is pretty tall. He's a little over a foot tall if you count his hat.
We'll be so happy, we'll always sing, if we remember one little thing. A little kiss each morning, a little kiss each night. Who cares if hard luck may be ahead? An empty cupboard, a crust of bread, a little kiss each morning, a little kiss.
Dollar Tree, and I'm going to remove its tail, and it had these little plastic, I believe it was supposed to whistle when you threw it, and that's what those were. I'm not even sure, but I removed those, and you don't even have to do this part. It ended up not being needed, that I cut off the end, but I'm going for an acorn here, and so I thought I needed to remove some of it, but I removed too much, so I added some back on and then cut a little more off. But you don't even have to cut any of it off, and you'll see why later. I took some antique wax and I watered it down. I just keep a bottle of watered down antique wax on hand because I use it fairly often like that. And I have some of these wooden spoons. I bought them off of Amazon, and I can leave a link to those where I bought them on Amazon down in the description box. And I use this watered down antique wax to stain them. Again, you don't have to do this step, but I wanted to fill in those holes that this football had. Your football might not have any holes at all if you recreate this. And of course, where I had cut off some of it and reattached it, I had a hole there. And so I fixed that, and I'm just wrapping most of the football with some twine. Now, I was just winging this. I did not even have a picture to refer to of one of these that someone had done so that I could see, how they did it. I do sometimes look at other crafters' crafts and try to recreate them myself, putting my own spin on them. But for this one, I had seen these wooden spoons used in another way, and I just thought that they would work good for this. So I wish if I could go back and do it again, I would have had the spoons start even higher up on the acorn. I didn't realize that as I was stacking the spoons that it was going to leave the football, if that makes sense. It was just going to be, there's going to be nothing underneath the ends of the spoons there. But you'll see what I mean in just a little bit. But for it, you could use a stick from your yard or whatever you have, but I just had this dowel rod that was a paintbrush, a foam paintbrush from the Dollar Tree, and I will be staining that as well. I was going in a pattern for the first 2 rows of the spoons, but then I realized that was not going to be able to be continued on up and to build up to the stem there. And so I gave up on the pattern, and that was fine. It looked fine, not in a pattern, and just overlapped them and just eyeballed it and tried to make them look as good as possible. So this turned out really cute. I really like it. I wish, like I said, I had went a little further up with the rope and that way there wasn't, it's like half of the acorn is the cap, and so it needed to be less than half of it, but it's still really cute. And at first I put some flowers on it, and I just liked how it looked simply without any sort of embellishments. But if you recreated this, you could do it however you liked. If you had a big basket and made quite a few of these, that would be really cute to sit around. Companion craft to a craft I did in my last video They are standing silhouettes, and you guys were requesting a male companion to go with the lady from last week. So to watch the matching silhouette, it's in my last video. I made this printable and it will be in the description box. The artist is August Edward. I'm probably saying that wrong, but he specialized in silhouette portraits and he passed in 1861. This man silhouette I actually pieced together from a couple of his paintings. I just cut this out and traced it twice onto chipboard, about the thickness of a cereal box. But you could use any material you like cardboard that will stand up on its own. I glued the two pieces together. One might have been strong enough, but I wanted it to be good and sturdy. The hat, in order for both the man and the woman to be about the same height, I had to do the hat separately, and that turned out good, unexpectedly, better than if I would have included the hat in his silhouette. And so if you want to do the hat, cut it out and do the same thing, do two of them, but leave the bottom, the bottom inside of the hat open and don't glue it. Just glue the brim of the hat on the edges and leave the center unglued so that you can slip that onto his head. And I just used Mod Podge to glue that onto his head. If I would have included the silhouette, then he would have been a lot shorter than her, in order to fit it on an 8.5 by 11 letter-sized piece of paper. For the lady in last week's video, I used spray adhesive, and this week I started out using Mod Podge, but it actually seemed like I regretted using the spray adhesive because I thought it didn't do a great job. I had to do a few layers, but I ended up having to do a few layers this way as well. So I guess there's just no, if anybody has any tips, maybe you could include that in the comment section. But I just, did a few layers of the cinnamon with adhesive. And then at the end, I put a top coat on top of it to seal that in, and it darkens up that cinnamon and makes it look better. I have this oval sign from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to fill in the holes there with wood filler. I cut off some of his shoes there to make him stand up, straighter, because you're not going to see them anyway. They're going to be inside of the stand. I will always have these decorated, so it doesn't matter too much how it looks down at their feet, because I'll always have some sort of, decoration around there. And each season I will customize, what they're holding and what's on her platter, and then what's around their feet to each season. I really wanted him to be holding a bucket of apples for the fall, and I might make that another time, but I didn't have a bucket that size. I would have literally had to it would have made the craft a lot longer. I would have had to make the bucket and make the apples, and it wouldn't have been difficult, but it was just a lot quicker to wrap up this little wreath for him to hold. Quick, you just need one of these pumpkins from the Dollar Tree, $1.25, And we're just going to take off the wrapping and take out the light. Just going to use this wire frame here. You could spray paint it. I thought that the metal actually looked pretty good by itself. And I have a candle cup. You can get them at, craft stores. They're pretty common, just type wooden candle cup on Amazon, and I found some on there, but I'm pretty sure I got this one from a thrift store. I took some more chipboard and cut out 2 circles, a little bit smaller than a canning lid, and I glued them together again just to make, to make them sturdy, to make it sturdy. And then I used hot glue to, fix that to the inside bottom to make a little stand there. You could paint the cardboard if you wanted to, but I figured since I was completely covering it, there was no need. But I am going to glue with hot glue here the candle cup, and I'm going to hot glue all around the candle cup with some small pine cones that I just found out in the wild. For the top layer, I took some and cut them in half so that I could just use the tops of them. You could use acorns, you could use, just make a bed of leaves inside of there. I think that would look very good. And then you could arrange them, however you like, however you think they look best. Now, they do sell candles that are short, taper candles that are short on Amazon. I believe they're 4-inch. I think that there are quite a few different types and sizes of candles that would work in here. Depending on your candle is, what type of candle holder you would want to use in there. And if you wanted to put decorations on the top, I think it would look good if something, there was something on the top there, but then obviously you would have to use a battery-powered candle. You could also, use a tea light candle, but I chose to go this route, and I really love the way that it turned out. It's very simple, but looks very nice. To start out, I'm going to make a template for the corn that I'm going to be making. So I'm just cutting out 3 different sizes on some regular paper of a corn shape, just eyeballing it. Then I'm going to take this chipboard. It's about the thickness of a cereal box. And you could use regular cardboard. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's thin or thick. And I'll be cutting those out, and I'm taking this foil cookie sheet and I'm going to trace around each of my chipboard pieces here and cut that out. I'm using a combination of E6000 and hot glue. The hot glue probably isn't doing much. Whenever you use hot glue with metal, that doesn't work out very well. So I'm just gluing the cardboard to the foil here. I have one of these little crates from the Dollar Tree, and I'm giving it a coat of antique wax, and I'm painting the corn the maize color from Waverly. And then that did take a few coats. This will be a printable in the description box. A link there for you to click it and print it if you want it. It is a label I found on Archive from the 1800s, a seed merchant label, and I just took that label and put it on a neutral background, and I printed that on cardstock, and I'm going to adhere it to the crate with some Mod Podge. I went ahead and sanded those edges in a downward motion just to give the edges a cleaner look. And I'm going to age this up just a little bit and make it look better on the box by darkening the edges with some antique wax. I have this very old pack of corn husks here. I got them a few years ago to craft with, and I did maybe one little craft project with them and then didn't use them again. So if you're wondering if these would last for crafting, they do. The corn just looked a little flat. I wanted to add some little speckles on them and just age them up just a little bit. At first, I tried using hot glue to attach the corn husks to the corn, but I did have to go back and add some E6000. Painting the corn did not trick the hot glue into not knowing that it was metal. It still, did not adhere very well to the metal side, and so I used some E6000 on that and just tried my best to make it look like corn. I did use Spanish moss in the bottom of the crate. I think that raffia would look very good in the crate as well. I took some Spanish moss and just sort of represent the silks on a corn cob. I put some Spanish moss on the top, and I did want to show you there that I did sort of finish up the back of these in case anyone turned them around and looked at the back. If you don't have one of these foil sheets from the Dollar Tree, another option I saw someone use is bubble wrap. They used bubble wrap to make corn like this, and it was really cute. One of the items was a book, and she made a fall themed book. And, where you cut out the inside and make like an opening inside the book and then you decorate it. But what blew my mind, it was so pretty, but what blew my mind is that she made the opening oval. I've never thought to do that. I haven't seen anyone else do that either. It's always a square opening inside the book. And so I thought that looked so pretty. And her DIY turned out so pretty, and I just wanted to make one as well. So I took this book from the Dollar Tree, and I painted it orange. I believe the color's pumpkin from Waverly. You'll have to excuse the giant flower on the screen there. I didn't realize that this book that I had grabbed from the Dollar Tree, I didn't even notice what book it was. I just wanted it for crafting. And it had quite a few bad words in it. And so I didn't realize that at first. And then when I, a little ways into the craft, I realized it. But I just wanted to cover that up. You probably wouldn't be able to see it too well. But if any of you have like a giant, 80-inch television, that would be just plastered right there on the screen. And I didn't want to show that. So I covered that up, but I did realize it about halfway through, and then I took some white out and whited out the words. But I just took some Mod Podge, and I did glue, the pages, like the first inside of the cover. I glued that, and then I took Mod Podge and went along the edges of the pages, and that is going to be enough to keep your pages glued open. And but you do want to do a couple of coats of the Mod Podge, and then that way your pages will no longer be able to open, and it becomes like a solid piece if you Mod Podge it like that. I took an oval. I had just used a wooden plaque as a template, and then made this paper template here. And I'm just going to take my X-Acto knife and just go over and over and over, tearing out, not tearing, but cutting out one little section of pages at a time until I end up going all the way to the back of the book by the end of the craft. This will be a printable in the description box. It is a page out of a book from I believe it's the 1940s. It could be the 1950s, I'm not sure, but it is a very cute pumpkin poem. I printed that on some ivory cardstock, and I'm just going to use some school glue to glue the, just to sort of stick this page inside the book here. It's harder to explain, it's easier to just show you, but I'm going to cover both sides here to cover up these original words from the original book that I used. Once that school glue set up, I took some glue stick and just glued these, new pages down onto the book. I got this Thanksgiving graphic from the Graphics Fairy. I will leave a link to that in the description box. I would not have thought to sand the inside of this opening with sandpaper if Kathy Jo hadn't done it. So it did look much better. I would have just left it, and it made it look much better to sand that paper and make it smoother. I took some of this antique parchment by Apple Barrel, and I just painted the inside of the opening there, where the words were, throughout the pages. I just didn't like the color that it was creating and the pattern it created, and so I just covered that up. I got this Pipberry garland from the Dollar Tree, and I just used that to frame it out. And this is where you can just use what you have on hand to fill up the bottom of this oval, and it just depends on the graphic that you choose to go on the inside. I believe Kathy Jo took a wood round and covered it with a napkin. But, just use different florals and different fall items and I just pretty much just got out everything I had and just played around with it to see what looked best. At first I was going to use one of these little plastic, clear, sort of translucent pumpkins from the Dollar Tree, it's like a bowl filler. But after playing around with it, I realized that it wasn't going to look good next to the little white pumpkin. And so I wanted to make some little apples. I didn't have any wooden beads small enough to make the apples, so I just took some of these little foam berries. It's like a little, I don't know what to call it, a little grouping of berries from the Dollar Tree. Some florals from the Dollar Tree had these. And I didn't even have to paint it. There was some red berries in there, and so I just took a little piece of that skewer stick there and painted it with some antique wax and glued those in there. And I thought it came across as apples. I think that, that it turned out good. I didn't have any tiny leaves, and so I just took a larger leaf, 2 different colors of leaves, and cut them down. Seen this craft already online. If you search pistachio shell flowers, there are all sorts of options and different flowers that you can make with pistachio shells. I'm going to be making some wheat. This is very easy to do. I'm just going to take these bamboo skewers from the Dollar Tree and hot glue each of these shells onto the top. You just want to overlap each shell, covering up any gaps you might have created. I love how this turned out, but it didn't look quite right. The craft turned out just like it looked when I saw it on Pinterest, but I wanted it to look more like the wheat I'm showing you here. I wanted it to have those little hairs coming out, or a representation of those. I don't know what those are called. I tried to look it up, and it's either on AWN or Beard. Those are 2 different things, though, I think, and I'm not sure exactly what I created, but I do like how it turned out. I just took some of these dried flower stems, and I glued each one to the top of each pistachio shell. At first, I glued it to the top, but then I, started gluing it into the center to where it was angled out. I decided that I did like the one with the little hairs better. I liked the look of it. But you don't have to do this, but I did want to darken them up just a little bit. So I took some watered down antique wax. In fact, it was a little too dark to begin with, and so I watered down that antique wax just a little bit more. And I like how it sort of dirtied it up a little bit. It wasn't much of a difference, but I did like that look better. I have this little plastic amber bottle from the Dollar Tree. They do, at my store, they have those this year. And I even went back and bought another one because I think I can think of some other crafts to do with it. And this will be a printable in the description box. It is sized to this bottle, but it's an old seed packet, the front of a seed packet from the 1800s. And I'm just going to Mod Podge that. But first, I did darken up the edges where you could see that paper where I cut it. I did put some ink, rub the edges of the paper on the ink pad to darken those edges up. To sort of stabilize the wheat in this little container here, I just poured some old corn kernels that I had. And I just love how this one turned out. It definitely screams fall. Okay, for this one, you could use, if you have a large styrofoam pumpkin, I looked for a thrifted pumpkin, but I didn't have any luck finding the size that I needed. You could also use a plastic bucket from the Dollar Tree or Walmart, the kinds that, kids carry around at Halloween. That would work as well. I got this set of stacking pumpkins at the Dollar Tree for $7, which I thought was steep, but if you think about it, if you split it between the 3 pumpkins, it's not so bad. I got this fairy door from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to make a fairy house out of this pumpkin. This has been done before, but I thought that looked so fun, and I wanted to put my own spin on it. The ones I've seen used more expensive, sort of fancier foam pumpkins, more decorative pumpkins. And so I wanted to make a more affordable version. The way the door was going to sit on the pumpkin, I would pretty much had to put it in the center there because it was going to be too cockeyed if I put it toward the bottom or the top. So the middle was the best option there. I started to cut out a hole for the door, and then I realized I don't need a hole for the door. These doors don't open. And so here I'm realizing I don't need to be doing this. I can just glue the door to the front of the pumpkin, and that's what I did. If you wanted the door to be closer to the bottom of the pumpkin so that you didn't have to make steps like I had to, you could cut a hole for the door near the bottom and then sort of set the door inside of the pumpkin, if that makes sense, so that it would stick straight up. You could, of course, build out the bottom as well. There are options. You just use your imagination and do what you have to do with your supplies. Now, you really do if you're going to do it the way I did it, you do need some sort of cutting tool, either a Dremel or a hot knife that would cut through the plastic. But of course, you could just glue things onto the pumpkin and not do any cutting. If you don't want there to be lights inside shining out of the pumpkin like I'm going to do, you could go, more basic and not do all these sort of extra things to it. I got these silicone molds that are frames, and they are in my Amazon store. The link to that is in the description box, and I'll put it up on the screen as well. I'm just going to fill this medium-sized frame here with some hot glue, and that's going to frame out one of the windows. I just wanted it to look like the fairy sort of found a couple of things to put on her house, and she found a picture frame and used that for one of her window frames. I have these tiny little bottles from the Dollar Tree, and I also have a plastic straw. I'm going to cut these down, and I'm also going to melt a hole. I want to make her some porch lights, and so I'm just going to use the straw, dip it in some wax here to mark where I need to make my holes and how big I need to make them. To stick the straw in there, I want to put the lights on the inside of the pumpkin and have them come out through those holes, through the straw, and into each little jar for her porch lights. I want the house to have sort of a whimsical look, of course, because it's a fairy house, so I'm offsetting the windows and making them different from each other. I have these fairy lights from the Dollar Tree. And this type of pumpkin actually worked. I was disappointed in the type of pumpkin I was going to have to use because I couldn't find what I really wanted. But this type of pumpkin actually turned out perfect for this project. The opening on the bottom was so large that it made it very easy to work inside of the pumpkin. I glued the battery pack inside and then sent the string lights, the fairy lights, out of those holes and through the straw and into each little jar. And I secured them with tape, but also added some hot glue as well. To mount each jar to each straw, I'm just going to use some of this gold floral wire from the Dollar Tree. And I'm going to be turning these straw pieces into little logs that are sticking out the wall of her house. So I'll be covering up this ugly straw here in just a little bit. I forgot to mention, even though it played, that I did take the Dremel and demolish that little fake lantern on the front of her door frame. And I just did that because if she was going to have porch lights, I didn't want there to be a fake lantern on that door. So I just sort of chipped away at that and tried to make it look as close to a flower as I could. For the other window frame, I'm just going to use some air dry clay, and this air dry clay is drying out rapidly. I'm going to have to, quit being so cheap and buy me some new clay soon. I've had this stuff for years. I just used some cornstarch so that the mold would release the clay. It still broke into pieces because it was so dry, but that didn't matter because I was going to just piece it together around that window anyway. I figured it would have broke anyway because I was bending it so much. I used a few types of glues for this project: Beacon 3-in-1, some Aleene's tacky glue, and hot glue. That 3-in-1 glue is in my Amazon store as well. I'm just wrapping these straws in this clay, and then I'm going to take this little poker tool from the Dollar Tree and make some lines for the bark. I used a few different types of paint, so I'm going to be layering paint, but I did use burnt umber as one of the coats. I took one of these skinny popsicle sticks, skinny craft sticks. I think they might also be called coffee stirrers. It's that size anyway. And I cut them down the middle with my miter shears, and I made some, what's that called? The divisions in the window panes. The opening in the top of the pumpkin was pretty big, and I couldn't just slap some clay on top of that opening, so I did put a wood round on top of that, glued that down, and then I went kind of crazy with I cut out a lot of the creative process, if you could call it that. I don't know how creative I was being. I just trying to make it look somewhat realistic, but it's hard to do when pumpkin stems aren't typically this big. They're usually much smaller, but I had to make it big to cover up that big hole. And it turned out fine in the end. What I ended up doing is putting a lot down and then cutting it away. That actually worked out pretty good. I gave it a pretty natural look to it, so it worked out. So that's why I said that you could use one of those pumpkin pails that kids use for trick-or-treating, because this had a pretty big opening and it still worked out. I think you could make it work. And if all else fails, if it doesn't look, too realistic, you could just cover the ugly with moss. That's what you can do with this type of project. I used Waverly Pumpkin Orange for the pumpkin itself. I just sort of layered on some browns. I used some Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel for the stonework around the door. And then what made it look really good near the end was when I took the antique wax and covered the door and then wiped that antique wax away. That really made the wood door look good. It went inside all the little crevices and just gave it some more dimension. I had to cut out quite a bit because the video was running way too long, but I did make some steps out of some jumbo craft sticks. That was pretty easy. I just eyeballed everything, and then I added a little bit of moss. I could have aged up, and I thought about it, aging up the pumpkins itself, putting some antique wax in all the little crevices and in the indentions of the pumpkin. But I just thought, when I looked at it when it was finished, I just didn't want to do that to this pumpkin. I usually age up everything. But this little fairy, she keeps a clean house. She keeps everything nice and neat looking on the outside. And so I didn't go crazy with the moss either. I just wanted to add a little bit, of course, around the door. I wanted to hide, the openings, the cracks where you could see behind the door. And so I did that. And I really like how this turned out. I forgot to record that I did paint the inside of the pumpkin black. That's pretty important if you're using a thin plastic pumpkin like I am, where the light might shine through if you have lights on the inside. So that's an important step, to paint the inside of that pumpkin black, and then you won't see the light shining through that plastic.
Say so, don't resist me, say you miss me from the start. Say so, for I pray so that it's true. There are just three little words I sigh for, crazy about them. Three little words I die for, can't live.
A printable in the description box. This is a hymn out of a hymn book from the 1800s, and I also put on there a silhouette of a turkey. I am going to glue with glue tape this silhouette to a black piece of paper. And then I'm gonna, detail cut around this using a combination of scissors and an X-Acto knife. Once I've got that cut out, that printed silhouette will stay on the back, but then I'll flip it over and then that'll make a solid black turkey silhouette. I've got this little shelf from the Dollar Tree. They come in a 2-pack and they still sell them, I believe. Last time I was there, I saw some of these. I sized the hem to fit right on this shelf. But of course, if you're using a different piece of wood, you can, in your print settings, print it at a higher percentage or a lower percentage, and that will, make it larger or smaller. And if you do use this shelf and recreate this, you always want to go in your print settings and do borderless printing. That will make it more true to size. I just used an extra strength glue stick to attach that to the center of the hem. I sanded away the edges, and then I, used those existing holes. I only filled 2 of them with spackling, and the other 2 I'm going to put a hanger in there. This is optional, but I did distress the edges of the print, and then I used that antique wax to stain the outside edge of that wood. And I did paint the back black because I had gotten some paint. I was just testing paint one day on it. I don't know why I used that to test paint instead of a piece of paper. But so there was a little bit of a mess on the back. So I did paint the back so it had a better, nicer look on the back. And I used some berry garland for a hanger from the Dollar Tree. To make a jar scarecrow, but I tried to put my own spin on it. I just took this jar from the Dollar Tree and it had "Congrats Grad" on it, and I just scraped that lettering off with a Dollar Tree scraper. I used a marker to draw the mouth before I painted the jar because I don't want to put paint where the mouth is. I want to be able to still see through the jar to see into the jar where his mouth is. I'm painting the jar in Cashew by Waverly, and it took 3 coats to do a really good coverage. I got this bell ornament from the Dollar Tree, and I just took the tinsel off and cut it in half, and I'm going to use one of the bells to be the form for our scarecrow's hat. I'm just cutting off some of the knobs and cleaning up the shape, and then I'll glue it together. I'm using this luau skirt raffia from the Dollar Tree and cutting some little short pieces, and I'm also cutting some longer pieces but ended up not using those. But I'm just going to glue the short pieces all the way around our lid to our jar, and if you're using a regular canning jar, this would work for it as well. I was going to do longer hair on the sides and back and have him have bangs, but I didn't. I thought maybe he would end up looking like Garth from Wayne's World, so I opted out of doing that and just gave him the same length the whole way around. But you could give him any style of hair that you want. I have this canvas drop cloth that y'all have seen me use in a lot of DIYs on this channel. The thing was huge. It's an old painting drop cloth from the Home Depot. And I'm just going to cut out a circle a good bit larger than the lid, and better it to be too big than too small because you could trim it up later. And just gluing that in the center. And this is the bottom of our hat, the brim. And then I'm just taking our bell shape and I'm going to glue the drop cloth to it as well. Once I get the top of the hat wrapped, I'll just glue the excess on the bottom here up underneath our bell shape. And leave the top of the hat open if you want to stick some raffia down in it like I did. I wanted the hat to stand up more, sort of like the scarecrow off of Wizard of Oz. A little bit different than the last scarecrow thing I made, but I did want the top to flop over just a little bit, so I pushed it over and glued it down to where it was bent over just a little. Then we're just gluing the top of the hat to the brim of the hat, and that's it for the hat. Because we made the hat and the hair all its own thing on the lid, it's going to be easy to remove the lid to put stuff down inside of it. I'm using these wood buttons from Walmart, and I'm just going to give them a coat of antique Waverly wax so that they're a good bit darker than the scarecrow's skin, so they'll pop. I wasn't recording when I drew the nose and glued the eyes on, but it's pretty self-explanatory. I just used some hot glue to put the eyes on, being careful not to put too much glue where the holes are so the glue wouldn't seep through the holes. And then I'm just going to color in the nose with the color Pumpkin Waverly chalk paint. Most of us have this burlap ribbon with the lace on top of it from the Dollar Tree. I'm just going to cut off part of the burlap ribbon that doesn't have lace on it. I had pulled it off of a section just to use the lace on another project. And I'm going to fray the edges a little bit just by pulling out some strands of the burlap to make a little patch to put on the scarecrow's hat. And I ended up making two of these to put two patches on his hat in two different places. I'm just gluing some twine along the top of the brim of the hat where the top part of the hat meets the brim. Then I'm going to tie a simple knot and the twine, a piece of extra twine, and just glue it onto the hat to make it look like that's where the piece of twine is tied. Now I'm using a brown Sharpie marker to outline the mouth and the stitching on the corners of his mouth. And we will also put some stitching on the nose. You can put anything in the jar that you like to show through inside the mouth. I put candy corn in there, but you could put other types of candy or just stick some extra raffia down in there. That would be cute as well to look like his stuffing. I wasn't able to craft this week, so I thought this fall compilation would be a nice kickoff to all the fall crafting ahead. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.